Hello and welcome to the Purpose of Business with Mr. Bhaskar Pramanik. For those of you who came in late, this is a mini series of 4 masterclasses on why and how to build a business with purpose. In the first episode, we discussed the need for purpose. In the second, we discussed strategy. In the last episode, we spoke about the importance of culture and how it often determines the course of strategy. Today, in the concluding episode of this series, we will discuss execution, which, as you know, is everything. But first, a quick introduction. Mr. Pramanik has held global leadership positions in several technology MNCs in Singapore, India, and the US. He was on the executive committee of NASSCOM and the national committee of CII and AmCham. Mr. Pramanik was chairman of Microsoft, MD of Oracle Corporation and Sun Microsystems in India. Currently, he is an independent board member and advisor to several companies. Thank you, Mr. Pramanik. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back. So in the last 3 sessions, we've covered the importance of purpose for both individuals as well as organizations. And, I've shared how purpose is nothing but your vision or your mission, but looked at it from a outward in perspective. It's really what you mean to the world, and how would the world, what would the world miss if you or your company didn't exist? And then in the next session, we talked about how to execute on purpose. And the way you do that is to basically build it into the DNA of your company. And when I meant the DNA of the company, I meant everything around the portfolio strategy and products, where you intend to play, how you intend to play. It's how you build it into the people and culture. How do you build it into the processes and systems, including the operational processes? How do you build it into the performance and metrics, how you measure yourself and your people and your leaders? And then how do you build it into the way you position yourself in terms of your external engagements? And then last time we met, we talked about how, purpose requires, we talked about performances of companies, and we said that, every organization tries to execute and excel in terms of its company's performance. And the way you do that is really 2 ways. One is we talked about collaborative engagement, where culture plays an important part. And we talked about how culture impacts the way in which you respond to the external environment. It's how people behave when nobody is looking, and how sometimes culture is perhaps even more important than strategy. And the second aspect of performance, what high performance companies actually do much better than others, is what I would call disciplined execution. And that's what we really want to talk about today. What constitutes disciplined execution? And to me, disciplined execution really stems from the mission of the company, the goals and its objectives. And integral to that is your choice of strategy and your strategic priorities, your targets and your milestones. These are really very critical to set yourself up for consistent and disciplined execution. And this is really the critical piece here, is that execution is execution to a strategy. And that's why the strategy piece comes in very, very important. And I'd like to, to give you an example of one of the companies I work for, Sun Microsystems, which I think, at that point of time in the early 2000s, it actually talked about the network is the computer. That was a pre-runner for what we call cloud computing. Now, yes, at that point of time, it was far ahead in terms of its vision as far as the company was concerned in terms of the technology. It had a great culture. It was considered one of the greatest startups in the history of technology. And yet, by 2010, it was actually sold to Oracle. And the reason for the fact that it did not succeed was not because it didn't have the right purpose, the right vision, nor that it did not have the right culture, but the problem was in terms of the execution of its strategy. Its strategic priorities were incorrect, and that can happen to any business where you've got the right goals and the right objectives, but the choice of strategy sometimes does not play out, and therefore you execute to the wrong strategy. So I think that's why it's important to understand why execution and strategy really go hand in hand.
Thank you. Thank you for that summary, Mr. Pramanik. So to make a meaningful and positive impact on the customers, community, and the world, it is clear that one must have to start with a defined purpose and run a great profitable business that requires executional excellence. So let me start by asking you, Mr. Pramanik, driving the strategic execution of a purpose-led business, would you classify that as an art form? Is it a science? You've led the biggest tech MNCs in the subcontinent. What has been your experience?
So execution is science. Execution is more engineering oriented than art because it's very logical and it's very repetitive. And it's very much aligned to the vision, the mission, the goals, and the objectives. So therefore, it is very purposeful. So I would not say that it's an art form. I think execution requires a lot of discipline. That's why I call it disciplined execution. It requires deep understanding of everybody in the organization, both implicit and explicit in terms of how they need to go about to achieve the strategic milestones. So it's definitely a very, very scientific way and a very organizational way in which you do things.
And through your experience, Mr. Pramanik, which have been the biggest challenges? What are the typical stumbling blocks that one would encounter?
So I think I think the key point towards execution is that I'm trying to remember the phrase, but it once said somebody once said that if you have vision without execution, then you're just dreaming. But if you have execution without a vision or a mission, then you're purposeless. That means you don't have any sense of direction. You don't achieve anything tangible. And that really, to me, is the point. The two are very, very critical and very important. You need to know what the end goal is. You need to choose the right strategies to be able to achieve the goal. And then after that, it is basically a process of ensuring what are the actions, what are the resources which are going to be put towards getting the maximum out of it. And I've found out that in most of the companies that I worked for, which have been successful, which achieved very much tangible goals, which actually outperformed the industry, it was that relentless focus on execution, never giving excuses, always being very clear about what the end target and goal is, and making sure that you go out and achieve that. Now, at the same time, if you don't have an end vision in sight, then you could continue to keep executing, but those executions really would not add up to anything substantial. So I think, that's the point I just want to make, is that you need to know what the destination is, and then you can actually plan what are the different elements in terms of activities, what resources you need to put for what kind of activity if you want to actually get there. So, it's very important that you get a balance around both.
Mr. Pramanik, to achieve high performance, it's quite clear that you need a certain level of collaborative engagement and disciplined execution. Through your experience, what happens if there's an absence of either one of the two?
Very good question, Arpit. I gave you the example of Sun Microsystems, which had a very, very clear-cut purpose, a vision, and a mission. And it also was a company which, in terms of its culture, collaborative engagement was excellent. However, it did not stand the test of time, mainly because of the fact that its execution was limited by its strategy. And to elaborate on that, Sun coined the phrase, "The network is the computer," which was what we call cloud computing today. But they believed that the way to achieve that was through hardware. And they built these massive servers which you could put into your data center, and they virtualized practically everything: the storage, the CPUs, the printing, and everything else, so that it was completely virtualized, which is really what the beginnings of the cloud were all about. And they basically priced, and that was part of the execution, they priced the products high because they believed that it was providing the value to its customers. The belief at that time, Scott McNealy, he once made a statement that as long as you can't download hardware over the internet, my business is safe. And that's where he got proven wrong, because what happened was that Intel and other semiconductor CPU manufacturers came and commoditized the hardware and made that very cheap. And Sun was left with very expensive servers, which nobody wanted to buy. There were alternates which were much, much cheaper. So this is a good example of where you had the right vision, you had the right kind of a culture, you were a technology leader, but in terms of the execution, you actually chose the wrong strategy, and therefore your company did not stand the test of time. It failed. It got bought over by Oracle. The other example I can think of where both of them were synchronized is really in my last gig as the chairman of Microsoft in India. And Microsoft was going through the same kind of a troubled time. There it had a problem both in terms of culture as well as in terms of strategy and execution. Actually, strategy. This is Microsoft pre-Satya Nadella is a good example of an organization where execution was miraculous. I mean, if I have not seen a company with sales and marketing processes which were so seamless. It was the way in which it actually ran its business. It was with utmost precision. And yet at the same time, it was not achieving the kind of results which it was hoping to. The saying in Microsoft in those days was that if you put washing machine into the sales funnel, you'd get market share at the other. It didn't matter what you sold. The processes were so fine. And then I think once Satya took over, because we were not getting results, he realized that we had to change other elements. He started with the purpose. He then moved on to the vision and the mission of the company. He changed the complete strategy, but he retained the executional excellence. And once you had that executional excellence, that's what translates into Microsoft's performance today, which is where it's the second largest company on the planet in terms of revenue. And if you look at, so not revenue, in terms of market capitalization on the planet today, and if you look at, it's recognized as the leader in cloud computing. So this is an example where a company which today has both the collaborative engagement and the culture, and it also has the ability to execute to a strategy which makes sense for the company.
Well, that is about all the time we have today. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. In summary, if you are still scratching your head, wondering where to start building a purpose-led company, I would suggest you begin with answering this one question. What would there be less of in the world if your organization did not exist? A lot to think about. Thank you, Mr. Pramanik, for these 4 most insightful masterclasses.
Thank you, Arpit. It was a pleasure being with you.
And you, dear viewer, thank you so much. I hope you have enjoyed watching this video. Do remember to like, share, and subscribe as well. Thank you.